All right, I know. All right. Hi there, everyone, and welcome back to Conversations with the Curator. This is a monthly behind-the-scenes look into our collections and our exhibits. My name is Sarah. I am the Community Engagement Coordinator here at NCHGS, and I am joined by my colleague, Tim Betts, today, our Curator of Exhibitions. Today is a bit of a heavy topic, so as we discuss enslavement and abolition in colonial Northampton County. In particular, I want to explore what enslavement looked like in Easton and in Bethlehem. And before we start, I'm not quite sure how much we'll get into this today, but trigger warning for sexual assault. What else have we got? I mean, everything is kind of a trigger warning.
Yeah,
it's the whole hour, honestly.
But
yeah,
especially the sexual assault, that's not for you today, we understand.
Yes. So if at any point you need to leave, please no apologies needed. We totally understand. Let's start off with, just to be perfectly clear, slavery as an institution did exist in the North. We don't talk about that very often, even into the mid-19th century, but it differed in many ways from enslavement as it was practiced in the South, right? So I thought we could start with Bethlehem, about 20 miles west of here, and then we'll move into Easton so we can somewhat go chronologically. The Moravians did not practice enslavement at the institutional church level, but they did allow for individuals to enslave men and women. What are some of the layers we can unpack?
There's a lot of layers to unpack there. And really, I mean, kind of big shout out right off the front here, right? Because like really the person who has helped us a lot with this, who's done a lot of research himself on this, is our institutional friend, Scott Gordon.
Yes.
He's at Lehigh, but he has worked extensively on the Moravians and enslavement, and had recently rediscovered the 1780 Register of Enslaved Persons for Northampton County. More on that later on. But so this is like a just kind of upfront big shout out to Scott Gordon, right? So the Moravians are enslavement in this period is a paradox, right? And I think we'll kind of talk about that a bit as well when we get to Easton. I could think of a particular person here. But for the Moravians, it's fascinating. Well, by fascinating, I mean horrifying, but also intellectually fascinating, right? Because the Moravians would have this understanding that all are equal in the eyes of God, right? That like you are all buried in God's acre. You are all of you, it's this equality under the eyes of the divine. But that, and this is like really, I'm like really taking heavily from our friend Scott, right? Because there is this idea, and recommend if anyone wants to kind of watch more about this, Scott, they gave a great talk about this at our Lehigh Valley 250 Keith colloquium in March. So ultimately, there were enslaved individuals at the Moravian settlement in Bethlehem. And they were Moravians. They gave Lebenslauf, which Dr. Hunt will probably talk about, right? But they were enslaved, right? They were legally considered to be property. But at the time of their death, they were buried with the other Moravians at God's acre, equality under God, right? So there is this tension, right? Because like there is this tension between the church teaching and like Christian teaching, really ultimately, right? And this idea that like there would be enslaved people working and living at that, right? But that is a very almost like an intellectual, very tight needle they're threading, right? Because it is this like justification that allows for it, but also softens it, because it's like there's right? So it is in a way, it's institutional, like even if it's not, people aren't, like the institution doesn't have enslaved people.
Right.
It's institutionally
Accepted.
accepted, right? And like, it's like someone too that, this is slightly out of the topic, but I think related in a way.
Mhm.
Like a lot, like my dissertation works about like not to get into it, but like about colonialism in what becomes Mexico.
Right.
And like one of the ways that like colonial violence happens is via conversion. Right? Like the Spanish come and it's like conversion by the sword.
Right.
Baptized or not, right? So like there is this, like, I think like you could talk about the missionary work of the Moravians as good-hearted, but like it is also colonial, right? There is an element like, so it's like I think that's kind of important, like as historians of the period, to look at that, right? You can say like, oh, they are like creating these dictionaries where they're talking to the Lenape and they're like interacting with like indigenous groups, but the question is why? And that is conversion, right? So like that idea of like institutionally kind of separating that out, that happens, it's not just the Moravians, it's happening everywhere, right? But like what it shows us, I think, for if I were to say like broadly about it, right? It's like there were enslaved people throughout all of Northampton County in the 18th century, not just in Easton, that people like the Moravians also, there were enslaved people there and there were enslaved Moravians, right? And it's like the way that enslavement looked varied and changed depending on where you were and when you were, but it was something, if you lived in Northampton County in the 18th century, you would have been aware of existing.
Right. And it's, it's interesting as historians it's very easy for us to say what we think we would have done at that time. And I can't help but draw that very clear parallel between where so many enslaved Moravians came from was not a coincidence that they were also lands that they went to be active missionaries in.
It's all connected.
Yeah, almost. Yes. Very odd. Yeah.
When the Moravians themselves are part of like a vast global network. Right. So that is going on. But yeah, it is this, you have to look at a broader lens, I think, right? But it's like, it's vitally important to say that they were there. Right. We know they were there. There's documentation that we know they're there. They're being registered on the register. Right. So it's like, they're there.
It's just a physical document. Yeah. Right. And not to, how many times do we circle back to your dissertation in these conversations, but in a similar vein, much of that conversion process is, as much as colonizers will try to articulate that you are equal spiritually, that is hardly ever reflected in practice.
Correct. Right. Yeah. So there's this like, oh, we're all brothers in God, right? But like there will be, that has absolute limits, right? Absolutely. And that we see that in Bethlehem. This is like Magdalena and Andrew the Moor were enslaved, right? And there was kind of
there's no getting around that.
No getting around that, right? Like there was a legal situation that they were in. No matter how much you could say, like, oh, in the end, we're all equal. What does that actually mean? Right.
If at any point too, you guys have any questions, please feel free to use the chat feature that's at the bottom of the Zoom bar if you hover over the main speaking screen. I do see some hands raised, so we'll get there as we are able to. We always have a question and answer session at the end as well.
Yeah.
So in keeping with the Moravian community, as we said, it was unique in a lot of ways, but also not unique in a lot of ways too. But one of the requirements of being in the community was that you were required to keep a diary. Everyone was required to keep a diary, primarily of what your spiritual journey looked like, but also just of daily life, you know, what were the goings on happenings in town, who was coming to town. This, fascinating to me, is required by both white Moravians and enslaved Black Moravians. What do these diaries tell us?
They're astounding, and they are that
Yes.
word I said before, the Lebenslauf. Right?
Yes.
It's a
Yes.
record of life, right? But they are astounding because they are in talking about the lives of enslaved people. We have to like circle back to this kind of idea that historians say that I kind of always like try to like talk to the general public about, and here I'm going to try to do it. The idea of archival silence, right? Because like if something is written down and if something is an archive, like an archive is a thing about power, right? Like who is writing, who is storing, what is preserved, what is documented, what is kept. That is power. Kind of hard stuff, right? So these are astounding documents because by and large, with exceptions, for people who are scholars who study enslavement, or it's in any attempt to like talk about this in a way that leads to like a discussion of where we're talking about these enslaved people as human people, which is vitally important, right? But like in any discussion you are doing there, the best documents are these documents of power, right? Tax records and probate lists and like censuses and legal documents and, you know, letters in which they're mentioned, but like very, very, very rarely, with some exceptions, is there a document in which you have an enslaved person giving an account of their life and giving an account of their like internal ideas, right? So it's like those Lebenslaufs of enslaved Moravians, they give us their life. They give it very much through the lens of their known world, and absolutely through like what that writing form is through the church. But there's, because like we go, that doesn't exist, right? It truly doesn't. And that is not saying that like, of course, and absolutely enslaved people would have articulated what their lives were like and we, you know, do that, but those documents don't exist, right? Because like, especially in the 18th century, the ability to write, writing, access to the written word, that's power, right? Like now we kind of take it for granted. We all like our, you know, like electronic devices and we like tip or tap and we're doing it, right? But like, to like record a story of your life is to record that is connected to having power and agency, right? So it's like those Lebenslauf documents from the Moravian settlement are astounding because it's like people talking about their life and it's essentially their words about their life and their recollections about it, right? Which is like as a source base of period, it's astonishing, right? Because it's like that is rare in the 18th century. That's rare in the 18th century for women. To be like writing about like, this is my life and this is how I felt about it. And like, this is my relationship with God and this is like my relationship with people, right? Like that doesn't really exist. Well, I mean, it does, but rarely. It's like upper class.
Certainly not to that extent.
So that is broadly an amazing source. But like that is those documents of kind of the lived experience of enslaved people. It's almost like almost unique, right? Because it's like for like it's like I said, like if you're really like the best, because it's like we as historians, we want primary documents. That's what we want. We need to cite it, we need a document from the period. And like that period of time, if there is a document created regarding an enslaved person, odds are that document is an instrument of their enslavement.
Correct.
Right? It is an objective, and you have to read it knowing that and read it and interrogate it, right? Because you have to like really ask questions about it and kind of read between the lines of it. But yeah, they're amazing. Like they don't, it doesn't exist.
And not to say the irony is not lost on us, but the fact that, you know, we are two young white individuals working at a museum, traditionally a place of power, discussing this.
Museums are a place of power.
Absolutely is. Whoa, not to pull your dissertation back into this again, but
Yes, they are.
but, and you know, the historian part of my brain immediately thinks, okay, we have these primary documents in these people's own words, their own language, but how much of that language was influenced by community expectations too? And then there's that part of my brain that tries to shut that off and just say, the fact that we even have these documents is already, as the kids say, a big win.
I think it's a big win, yeah, but like, it's also like anything any of us write is part, so it's like, yeah, I mean, they're based on community expectations, they're created, and that's like, I'm by no means a Moravian scholar.
Right,
So
right.
that, in my understanding, they're created to be read at like the funeral of the person, right? Like as a record of their life. So yeah, of course they're tinged with community expectations because they lived in a system, right? Lived in a community, but like likewise, any of our writing is tinged by
Absolutely
the community, our community expectations, the system in which we live. That's how we interpret the world too, right? So it's like, yeah, they're tinged by like the Moravian community, but we're tinged by the 21st century.
Right.
So it's like,
Right.
it is the source.
Yes. And then juxtaposing, you think like, what if the Moravians had Twitter?
That's a whole other thing. Yeah.
Anyway, so I do want to address one of Chuck's questions now before we move on chronologically. Can we put a time frame around Moravian slavery?
We can, so at least I will vaguely, because I'm not, again, not Moravian is not quite my thing, right? So it's, I would say there's slavery in Bethlehem since the beginnings of the Moravian settlement into post the revolution.
Okay.
Let's say like around 1800.
Okay.
And that is, that's kind of based on what I've looked at with like very much the caveats of like, I am not a scholar of the Moravians and I've just kind of been looking at them a little bit because I've really been focusing a lot on the East. Right. So, yeah, I think that kind of periodization is very important and that's kind of what I put it. And I think that feels right.
We'll get into.
I'm very comfortable giving an I'm not.
Right, yes, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. The only dates on my end that I'm uber familiar with are the founding in 1742 and the register in 1780.
And they're there in 17.
Right, right. Yes, we do have more questions, but we're gonna get there, guys, I promise. So let's continue on chronologically to talk about Easton. So we'll work up to the 1780 register in a second. But we are, I'd say if you were to drive a 15-20 minute drive in our 21st century context, what did enslavement look like in Easton, being at that time what would have been a distance from Bethlehem? What did that look like? How did it differ from Bethlehem?
So both are, in Bethlehem, it's absolutely enslaved. They're enslaved in a institutional setting, and that is tied to labor, right? The Moravians are makers of things, right? Which is kind of what I'm fascinated by the Moravians about. But Easton, what it seems to be, at least at that period that we know for sure, let's say 1780s when we know for sure.
Right.
If they're in Easton, they are in homes, and those homes are laboring sorts. Shopkeepers, there's a lawyer who's kind of the exception. Storekeeper, there's a miller, there's a tanner, there's a tavern keeper. So enslavement in Easton, I would say, is by an individual. There's an individual enslaver, and there are that person has a trade, and the enslaved person is working on that as well.
Okay.
Be it in a shop, be it in a tavern, be it as a tanner. That is very different. You alluded to at the beginnings of our discussion, right? That's very different from what historically people are more familiar with.
Right.
The institution of slavery to look like, which is Southern plantations, right? Definitely in this period in the 18th century, and this is what will lead to compromises with the South that leads rise to this compromise and the Electoral College, by the way, is this idea of like there is a large population of enslaved people in the South, and there is a large population of enslaved people in the Caribbean, because it's plantation system, which is to say there is large amount of land, and then there is labor on that land. That will happen somewhat in the North, especially places where slavery lasts longer, like New Jersey, the Garden State, right? But especially this part of Pennsylvania, there is on a farm, but there isn't that plantation model, right? Because the plantation model is read a book about it once about how the plantation model is what gives rise to modern day capitalism, because it's ultimately kind of like a factory model, right? But so we're talking in 1780, that number, it's I always like to check so I get the number right. There are 13 enslaved people in Easton in 1780.
Okay.
And they range anywhere from they're all in private businesses, but anywhere from many of them are connected to store owners. But anywhere from taverns to tanners to stores.
And that number, we say 13, and to us it may not seem significant, but Easton's population was still so small.
Yeah, Easton's population is 450, which means that the enslaved population is around 3%.
Not insignificant.
Not insignificant.
Right. So there are a few individuals I want to touch on. As we prepare more for 2026, we'll get into them much more in depth than we have time to do right now. Let's start with, there was a question in the Zoom, in the chat about, again, trigger warning for folks, for sexual confrontations and what happens to children of those confrontations. We're gonna get there, guys. Hang on.
Very good question, of which I have many questions.
Also, yes. But let's start with Tom and Sam first, because their story and who they are enslaved by is very significant.
Very significant. So Tom and Sam. So I keep just as a thing, because it's like really the best source we have, and this is an astounding document. Not to like go slightly, off the question, and I'll go back to it. Is a document that I keep referring to as the Register. It is the 1780 Register for Enslaved People in Northampton County. The actual title, it's long and very 18th century. That's connected to Pennsylvania's Gradual Emancipation.
Yes.
Which is in itself a act of violence, right? Because we talk about Pennsylvania's Gradual Emancipation, but the key here is gradual.
Gradual, yes, absolutely.
So the way the Register worked, it's if you were an enslaver in Northampton County, by a certain date, you had to send a letter or go personally to the county magistrate, relievers, who I am obsessed with.
Ooh,
Problematic faith.
Yes.
But not faith, but just fascinating.
Let's put a pin just for a second, that this register includes both Easton and the Moravian communities.
It includes all of Northampton.
Yes, just so we're clear about that.
Absolutely, 100%. So what happens is when you're registering them on the register, the number of people on the register is 58 enslaved people for Northampton County.
That's very significant.
That's a significant that's a significant number.
Right.
That ranges anywhere from 75 in age. 75 years old is the oldest. The youngest is 2 months old.
That still makes my blood.
That is significant, right?
Yes.
But the way the law worked, and it's of course a complex legal construction, but essentially if you were registering someone on the register in 1780, that was the sending of a letter and the signing of a document that ensured that that person would be enslaved for life. Be they 75 or 2 months old. So that's what gradual emancipation is. This document was alluded to. This is a legal document. There's elements of it that are, it lists the enslaver, the enslaver's occupation, where they are. It lists the names of slaves. It lists servants by year, and that's kind of categorizing other people. It lists mulattoes, mixed race people. It lists age, sex, and then there's some notes. But this is a legal document that ultimately was registering people for life. It was recently rediscovered by Scott at the archive at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania.
This is in Philadelphia, by the way. Yes.
This is an astonishing document, and we've been using it long. So why I mentioned that, right? So on this register is Tom and Sam. And we know Tom and Sam are registered, and they're registered late. They're both 30 years old, approximately. They're listed as 30 on the register, and the letter registering them there listed as around 30. But they are registered by George Taylor. So George Taylor.
Let's unpack that.
Eastern signer of the Declaration of Independence registers Tom and Sam. So there's a whole thing with him because he had been in New Jersey for much of the Revolution. He's not really
in Pennsylvania. Yep.
Or he's at Durham, or he's at another iron furnace he has in Pennsylvania, in New Jersey.
He's not here for the most part.
Here.
Right.
He comes back right before his death. He's going to die in the George Taylor house. I'm pointing, but that doesn't mean much. It means only something for me and you.
Right.
He's going to die at
which is
now the George Taylor
perhaps
house.
a block from here, if that.
Absolutely. I'm going to pass it on my way to the.
Yeah.
It is on the corner of 4th and Ferry Street now. George Taylor dies there. He's buried in what will become the parking lot across the street and then moved to the cemetery. But he moves here. He moves here after the law after the law's cutoff period. Then he writes a letter that he's in violation of the law and didn't realize it. But George Taylor registers 2 people a year before his death. 4 years after he signs the Declaration of Independence, right? So George Taylor is Easton signer of the Declaration of Independence. And I would say I am relatively certain, like until this point in time, like perhaps even me saying this now, like I'm not necessarily sure there's been much public discussion that George Taylor enslaved 2 men. George Taylor is, of course, not the only enslaver to sign the Declaration of Independence.
By any means.
Famously, it was written by an enslaver, Thomas Jefferson, right? But it is this paradox, and this I keep saying this because I think it's like exceptionally. I mean, you've heard me say this, but I say this to people, right? So Easton is one of 3 places where the Declaration of Independence is read simultaneously in Center Square on July 8th, 1776. One of the first places it is read aloud.
Are we hard confident that that was that date?
We are 99.9% sure of that.
Okay, because I know certainty as historians freaks us out. Okay,
right. So when the Declaration of Independence is read, it is within earshot. Absolutely sure. Of at least 3 enslaved people. At least. And one of the people that signs a document about inalienable truths of life, liberty, and happiness owned to people, right? Therein is the paradox, right? And therein is kind of really what we organizationally are trying to talk about as we reach 2026, right? Which is like, when that happens, it is not independence or freedom for all, right? Certainly not for Tom and Sam. Certainly not for any of the women in the audience at the reading of the Declaration of Independence, right? It is liberty and independence for white landowning men, right? which is of course the story of the continuance of the attempting to reach the high enlightenment goals of the Declaration, right? But like, that is vitally important. Like, that is a fact that the people that signed that document were very, very, very imperfect men, right?
That's putting it very nicely.
Jefferson was imperfect. George Taylor was imperfect, right? Even my favorite, Benjamin Franklin, imperfect, right? As we all are, right? But like, they also owned people, right? And that is very important to just say repeatedly, right? That doesn't mean that wasn't a very important moment, or the founding of the nation wasn't also very important, but
it's time for our favorite word, nuance. There you go.
Important. But yeah, Thomas and they were there.
Yeah, and so we've been talking about it in the office casually, as you know, historians do talk about these things regularly, but so much of the work is checking ourselves as the people who are, for better or for worse, we're the ones taking on, you know, we call it, you know, Project 2026, or the very long, the Lehigh Valley 250. There's so many names, and like, as much as you want to say it's a project, or it's our next exhibit, it's our next work, the undercurrent of every exhibit or every project is that we are dealing with people who lived and had dreams and had thoughts, who lived very nuanced, complicated lives.
Because I think like you can very easily be in this work that we're doing. Because there's I mean, we have a lot to do before 2026, Sarah.
It's less than a year.
There's a lot going on.
Slow down.
So I think you could very easily get, you know, like being a curator is a cyclical thing, right? Like being a historian is a cyclical thing. You do work on one project and then you go to the next project, like warehouses, and then the warehouses will go away, right? So it's like, especially when you're working on like attempting to tell unheard stories like this, right? Like, it's very important that you do, like, yeah, you have to think of it as something that eventually gets made accessible to the public, right? Like, there has to be like we're kind of ready date, but this is a broader discussion.
This is always going to be ongoing.
It is ongoing. Yes. This is absolutely not done for 2026. This is, I'd say, like 2026 is like the first phase of this, right? Because it's like, we're not going to know everything.
Right. And a lot of it too is not to, you know, I mean, exhibits take time to get together. You gather the materials, you write the exhibits, you plan the programs. But so much of why, I don't want to say why this is taking so long, but why we're not just announcing an exhibit 6 months from now is because this work is so, like, if it was easy, would someone else have done it earlier?
And it's very like, like, whenever I'm doing research on anything, I like to ensure that everything I say is either footnoted or couched in like a footnote that lists many sources to it, right? But like, just because I'm like an academic that's been writing too long, right? But like, especially something like this, very, very, very important.
And to our responsibility, if we aren't certain about something, we have to be very clear that, to the best of our knowledge, or based on the sources that have so far been uncovered in the archives.
Absolutely. And I think part of it is, like you mentioned about archival science, right? Like, I think part of it is like, sometimes I'll talk to people, like, I'm a historian, I'm doing in museums, all that. I'm like, oh, you know, I didn't like history class, I could never memorize the dates, blah, 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 right? But it's like, dates are such a minuscule, like such a minuscule part of it, right? Because like, ultimately there is so much we don't know, right? And there's what you kind of have to do. There is the things we know, the things we don't know, and the things we don't know. Well, the things we don't know, and then the things we don't know that you can find an answer to,
right?
Which in this case is minimal.
One of my favorite phrases about this is, we don't know what we don't know.
Yeah,
It's like, it's so frustrating.
like a George Bush quote, like the knowns and unknowns and the known unknowns and the, you know, that sort of thing. But like, yeah, there is like, with the past, the larger more back in time you go, when you're dealing with like archival silence, and things like that, there's more you'll never know.
Right.
Like, there's a lot regarding the enslaved people about Northampton County that we're never going to know. And that is kind of part of the story, right? Like that uncertainty is part of the story. But like, I'm very uncomfortable saying like, you know, like, oh, this person went here.
We don't know
I
that.
don't know that.
Yeah.
I don't know that at all, right? So. Yeah,
Was it likely? Maybe. Can't prove it though. Yeah.
I can say with certainty where they are in 1780.
Yep.
That's kind of it. Some people a little bit later, but.
But had we not had Scott not uncovered that document by almost accident, where would we even be?
Which is why we archive them.
That's it. That's it. That's it. Museum field trip.
Yeah.
So we, yet again, we could make this a whole afternoon discussion. But let's touch on Phyllis.
Okay.
Trigger warning for sexual assault and documentation of sexual assault. So if this is too much for you, please, we understand.
It's also very important to say.
Right.
So Phyllis is the one I particularly thought about, and she's who I'm thinking about with the Declaration. Right. So she is enslaved by Michael Hurt. He is a merchant who it's like there I'm doing the historian thing where I'm talking in the present tense.
Yes.
Michael Hart was a storekeeper who had a store on Center Square, on the south side of Center Square.
Right.
And
today, just for context too, his store was where the building that they just tore down to make room for that hotel, that big empty space.
The Meyer building. Yeah. So the original courthouse where the Declaration of Independence is read is in Center Square. Right. And the steps were facing south. Which is to say, when whoever got up there and read the Declaration of Independence, a thing we don't know who did it, saying that out loud, they were reading it. Phyllis was right there. Right there, right? So Michael Hart registers her in 1780. She is, let me go in my thing here, because I want to be sure. She is 18 in 1780. She is young. He registers her in 1780. She's in his shop. 3 years later. So there are only 3 documents that describe Phyllis.
Okay.
That we know of.
Right.
The letter that Michael Hurt sends to Robert Levers registering Phyllis. Okay. That's the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. She is listed on the 1780 register.
So that's number 2.
Just number 2. Okay. Number 3 is a document in 1780. Okay. And this document raises more questions than answers.
Now in 83, she is 21.
21.
Okay.
This is 3 years after he registers her on the register. She goes to Robert Levers, the county magistrate. And Robert Levers takes a testimony from Phyllis. Why she's there, what got her to be in that room, why Robert Levers listened to her.
Was this in the courthouse, do we know?
We don't know where this happened.
Okay.
This Robert Levers' house was actually very near where the Hart's shop was.
Oh, yikes.
So they're all in very close proximity. So I don't know where that happened.
Okay.
So whatever happened, Phyllis goes to see Robert Levers and he takes an account, essentially, where it's in Robert Levers' handwriting, but you can tell it's taken as Phyllis speaks. And it is an account in which she describes that Michael Hart, the man who enslaved her, repeatedly raped her. It gives a account of the first instance, I would say, where he lures her and it happens. Then there's repeated rape. By the time she goes to see Michael Hart, she's pregnant. No, by the time she goes to see Robert Levers, she's pregnant with Michael.
In 83.
In 83.
Yep.
He takes the testimony, Phyllis signs it, and by sign it, I mean she makes an X, because she probably couldn't write it.
Okay.
Right? That is then the last thing we know about Phyllis. So in 1790, there's
Okay.
a census.
Mhm.
The Harts are on the census.
Mhm.
There is a category on the 1790 census that lists, in slave, right? Like, is there a slave? There isn't in 1790.
Oh,
However, there is one person who is listed neither by gender nor by age in a category which is a catch-all category in the 1790 census,
okay.
which is essentially for a person who is free but is not white. Which that's summarizing what that category does.
Okay.
We don't know who that is.
Not
So
listed by gender, not listed by
just
age.
listed by
Great.
a number, which is helpful but unhelpful.
Yeah.
So we do not know
Mhm.
why Phyllis goes and doesn't.
Mhm.
It does not appear that Michael Hart, there's any prosecution against Michael Hart, because ultimately, legally, Michael Hart didn't necessarily, Michael Hart's rape of Phyllis was not legally involved.
By 1783
By
standards.
1780
Right.
standards. By our standards, absolutely.
Yeah.
By 1780 standards, legal rape.
Right.
Right? That probably, if there would have been a case, it would have been connected to the child or some sort of, right? But like, we don't know what happens to the child, if the child is born, if Phyllis survives childbirth, childbirth in the before the pre-modern era.
Not great.
Medicine.
Yeah.
Childbirth was very dangerous. So we don't know where she goes after 1783. But like the Moravians, like those documents at Bethlehem, that document where Phyllis goes and gives this account, while it's in Robert Lever's handwriting and his words, there's even a point at which you can tell the immediacy of it because Phyllis uses a word. And the word is, we don't know what the word is.
Okay.
But it is regarding a sexual act. And Robert Levers wrote it and then he wanted to not have that, whatever word that was being used.
And we can't tell what that word is because
I'm gonna go through there and see if I can figure it out with you. But it's immediate, right? It's happening, she's there and she does it, but like that document is, it's an important account of the violence of slavery, right? But it's a mystery.
Right.
We don't know why. I have a theory, but we don't know why she's there, why he listened, what happened, why he took it. We don't know what happens after that. There's a lot of kind of theories. There's an enslaved woman named Phyllis that appears with a child a couple of years later in an ad, in a kind of notice in a newspaper that she appears somewhere in New Jersey, and the years kind of add up, but it's like, all we know is that this is also a woman named Phyllis who also has a child, which
maybe, yeah.
But like for us, and I mean for me, I think it's like there is that uncertainty of we're never gonna know.
Right.
Absolutely, we're never gonna know what happened to her, right?
Unless there's a magical
Unless there's
document
a
floating
magical
that we've
document
never seen.
floating around somewhere.
Yeah.
That's what you hope for. Right. But we kind of have to live in that uncertainty.
Right.
And that uncertainty is the system in which, I mean, the violence of the system in which Phyllis lived. Right. But like that, just saying that there was someone like Phyllis and that happened to her here in Easton, like, right, not far.
You
from
could
where
throw
we're
a rock
talking.
and probably hit it. Yeah.
I mean, like, it's very important because like you've said too, like we started talking about this and you do get a lot of people well-intentioned who will say like, slavery didn't happen in the North. It did. It's just how we kind of colored the Civil War.
Right.
You know, so yeah, it did. And she was there.
Right. And in terms of, again, because we don't know, for the sake of consideration, I guess, if Phyllis gives birth her child survives, she survives.
Mhm.
What would have happened to that child in light of that register? Would that child also have been enslaved? Or
That would,
was,
I think that would depend on a lot of factors.
okay,
That would depend on the child could become enslaved, the child could be registered and be freed after a certain age. That child, excuse me, that child could have been freed outright if Michael Hart claimed the child. But that there isn't necessarily, at least kind of in my understanding of like how Pennsylvania's gradual emancipation law works in 1780, like there isn't an automatic status for that child. I mean, like, I think the status would be enslaved, like the status would lean towards enslavement, right? But there is, that's a gray area, because it's a thing that, it's a thing that happened, right? It's just like absolutely people who are on the register, like that are listed in that category of the mixed race category. Like John Jones in Bethlehem Township registers that 2-month-old who's named Dick. And he's registered as a mulatto, or mixed race person, right? So if he's a 2-month-old mixed race child living on in this situation, it's probably the child of John Jones, right? There's the other person that he registered is a 20-year-old woman named Susanna. So that's probably, I think, what would have happened, right? He would have been registered as probably a mixed race person.
okay,
And that allowed, there was a cap on that. Like there was a period at which that was out, like upon reaching majority.
Okay, okay. There's a couple questions 18th century related, and then I have one more question that I want to touch on as we get into the 19th century. Based on the register, do we know if there were any enslaved people outside of Easton and Bethlehem?
Yes, actually.
Oh, that was okay.
And it was a forceful yes, because you don't know this, but I had the register open on my computer. And right when
we couldn't show the slide.
No, I just have I have my spreadsheet of it. It's not great. Helpful, but not great. But I closed it so that my forceful is like I need to reopen it. So yeah, so there are in Lower Smithfield. They're working on farms. There's Delaware Township, Hamilton Township. Some of these townships I'm saying are Northampton County's original borders.
Okay.
That includes, you know, up until like Monroe County,
Right.
Almost like across Schuylkill County.
Okay.
Yeah, so like
Yeah.
big,
Right.
big Northampton County. There's many in Mount Bethel. Bethlehem Township, Forks, that's Jacob Hunt, registers 2 people. And that one's actually significant because we have the letter that he registers them with in our archive upstairs. Hamilton, that's now like essentially Allentown, Lower Saucon, Delaware, Lower Smithfield. So yeah, it's not just Easton and Bethlehem.
Okay.
And I would actually say that the majority, like the number that makes up that majority of that 58, they aren't in either, like the largest population is Easton at 13.
Okay.
Then the next largest, I would say, subcategory of that are not in Easton or Bethlehem.
Okay.
Points north and south, particularly points north, and they are on farms. And another note of this, which is the thing I've been wanting to research, but just to say out loud, 1, 2, 3, 4, yeah, 4 of the people registering enslaved people on the register are women. Yes. Which is very interesting. They almost
There's a whole lot to unpack there.
Almost more assuredly, and I want to do more research on them. And this is just kind of based on kind of understanding of the 18th century. They almost assuredly were widows. While we kind of classically think of women in the 18th century not being able to own property and all that, widowhood allowed for widowhood was kind of a legal gray area.
Okay.
Where women could have property
Mm.
or could hold property until like their minor son was of an age.
Oh.
And that allowed for women to have property. And a widow could function differently in society than a married or an unmarried.
Okay.
And that would include like holding of property.
Mm-hmm. It's funny because it makes me think of the unique case of the Bachman, right? That Katrina's name is on that plaque out in the front, which is so rare, especially for 1753.
Exactly.
But we have a question that, and I'm going to tie this into Bachman sort of tangentially, but the question is, do we have any, that we know of at least, any correspondence or diaries about Samuel Sitgreaves leaving his enslaved man, Cujo, the property that he left? Because we do, and I guess also from my own perspective, do we have documentation of when Theophilus Shannon at the Bachman? I don't know what the verb that I want to use here is. When Cujo is, I guess.
When Cujo is at Bachman. Right. Theophilus Shannon, who owns Bachman, registers an enslaved man named Cujo. I would say the Sitgreaves, the leaving of the property to Cujo / the broader story of Cujo, that has been like the one I've been kind of working on. So it's like not really, I haven't found anything yet.
Okay. Okay.
It's definitely been something that's been like talked about and referenced and kind of broadly known, but
as are many things in Easton that
I've
we
been
don't.
wanting to find like the document itself, right? So Sitgreaves is absolutely a character in this. There's a fascinating document connected to the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. Where Sitgreaves is part or attempting to see if he could be the lawyer for a case of an enslaved man who was on the register who says he shouldn't be on the register. And he shouldn't be on the register because he is added to the register by Robert Levers himself, who added people on the register. And he says, I know of the possession of these people. The application has hitherto been neglected because of the troubles of the times. So Robert Levers unilaterally enslaves these people on the register, and then there is a case that involves Sitgreaves. So Sitgreaves has kind of been there, but concretely, I haven't found any documentary discussion of the Sitgreaves Cujo relationship. That is a topic of current research. It's a very good question.
Stay tuned for 2026.
Yes, and it's like, even if the Cujo at Bachman is the same Cujo.
Fair.
Which that
we can't prove either.
We can't prove that either.
Right. Yeah. Right. So, Howie asks, were there any enslaved people at Christian Spring? That was unusually chipper. I did not mean to ask that question in such a high voice.
Not that I'm aware.
Okay, interesting.
At least not 1780. Cool. That's the damn room age factor.
Great. Well, at least we know it works. Chuck also says that Trinity and Sitgreaves deny any slave ownership. Interesting.
Sitgreaves is definitely.
Give us more research, guys.
Sitgreaves kind of about that time I was mentioning, like he is he is at least very publicly pro-abolition. Like I do love Sitgreaves. So I think there's like a whole nut to uncrack with Sitgreaves. But my aside Sitgreaves is whenever he signs a letter. Usually in the 18th century, there's all these I am your most humble and obedient servant, etc. and so forth. And these but Sitgreaves always just signs it like the letter and then just as Sitgreaves without any additional.
He's tired by that point. All right. So last question before Zoom kicks us out as usual. Post 1780. We can see the community dynamics start to change. but it's, again, gradual is the real key word here. Yeah, so we are looking at people still being enslaved for at least another generation.
For at least another generation.
And math is not my greatest suit, but if we're going from 1780 to 1860, early 1860s with the Civil War, you're looking at a good 80-year chunk.
Absolutely.
Of when slavery was still.
Legal.
Thank you. I was going to say permissible. That's not the word.
It's Pennsylvania,
Right.
right? That like there was
Yes.
slavery here.
Yes.
Like, oh, like William Penn was like
A friend.
William Penn was
Yeah.
a friend. William Penn had enslaved people at Pennsbury.
Oh
Like,
yeah.
When
Oh
he was
yeah.
living there, there were enslaved people
Yeah,
at
yeah.
Pennsbury.
Yeah. Not even to get into what his sons did. That.
Not even to get into
Jesus.
But yeah, but absolutely, it's like we've kind of like. There's a lot of like national myth making.
Right.
Absolutely, but there's a lot of state myth making,
Right.
right? And it's like, yeah, like. There was, but then it goes away.
Right.
It's like, no, there are people who are. I think into the 1820s, there's people who are for sure.
Oh, I don't think that's a stretch to say at all. Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
But then, I mean, the thing too, it's like, even if there is, let's say, total emancipation
Mhm.
in Pennsylvania, there are still, and are still,
Mhm.
systemic realities,
Mm.
right? Which is a
Mm.
clinical way of saying that, I
Mm-hmm.
suppose, right? That it's like, just because you have emancipation doesn't mean there's equality, right?
Ooh.
So,
Ooh. That's a good one.
yeah,
Yeah. Whew.
but the work continues.
It
Our work
must.
continues, and
It must.
I say this whenever I say this, whenever we talk about this, right? We're just really starting to talk about this publicly.
Mhm.
You know, like this is very much a community
Mhm.
project. Like,
Right.
we want the help of people in the community. We want to talk to people in the
Yeah.
community about it. We are, of course, like hotly on the trail of any 18th century document
Right.
that could contain a reference to it. If you have an 18th century document around and it looks interesting, let us see it.
Yes,
for
yes,
sure.
please do.
Because any document, you'd be surprised if we can learn from it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But like, this is the start really of us talking about this really publicly.
Right.
And us working on it organizationally. So this is absolutely not the end of our discussion here.
No, not by a long
Really
stretch.
kind of everything we've said, you know, it's the beginnings of
Mhm.
research, it's work we're working on.
Mhm.
Even we know that's not gonna be done and it's ongoing.
It'll
It's
never be
certainly
done.
Never gonna be done, and certainly not gonna be done for 2026, right? But it is, we all here believe.
But
it's very
that's the field though, too.
Yeah.
The work is never done.
important.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's very important.
And I don't want to say we're at that good juncture right now, but even just figuring out the best ways to talk about this is part of the work. Like,
Absolutely.
it's incredibly uncomfortable.
Yeah, like how you talk about Phyllis. Exceptional, it's hard.
Yeah.
But it should be.
I want to acknowledge Ashley quick. She has to leave, but she says, this has been such an awesome event. I'm sorry I have to go, but thank you for facilitating. We're going to keep going. So
We do this every month about all sorts of stuff.
yes, about a whole variety
Yeah,
of topics, but
this particular work
Mhm.
is ongoing.
yes, and you will absolutely not see the last of Phyllis
No,
or Tom or Sam or all of
absolutely
these
not.
stories.
Or others that we didn't introduce here.
Right, just for the sake of time. So stay tuned, everyone, and thank you for joining us as we work through all of the difficult history that we have so far pretended has not existed.
It doesn't make it go away, sir.
No, it doesn't. In fact, it circles right around and whacks it to the ground. And
It does that, doesn't it?
it does.
Yep.
It does. Well, in other words, we are here for you, and we are gonna figure this out together
Yes.
in community, because that is the
Community.
only way forward.
Correct.
That's my mission statement of the day. So again, as this will be posted up to YouTube, I want to make sure that all of your comments This is why I ask that you use the chat feature so that when I address them, I make sure that I am addressing them in the correct way. So there are so many ways that you can continue to support our work, such as by becoming a member. Your membership really does help us to just keep the lights on and things like that we get to sit here and talk about this on a Wednesday afternoon. Is honestly, this is probably the least stressful program series that I have. Yay! Yay! Oh, so many ways to go with that. You know, see, some of these conversations are real serious and real hard, and some of these conversations are just unhinged. Sometimes there's deranged paper mache puppets that go back in their box at the end of the season.
Yeah.
So you can find all the different ways to support our work by visiting sicklemuseum.org/support. And thank you again to everyone, and we will see you next month. Next month is Women's History Month, so we are going to talk about Norma Colmar's glass plate negatives, which are so, not only, I'm photography nerd, but also the fact that the glass plates are in such good shape and that we have so many of them. And again, she was like,
we can talk about emulsions, Sarah. Let's not give it away.
Just to document daily life by photography in its infancy as a medium, to see what downtown looked like in perhaps 1906.
But more on that next month.
Stay tuned, and we will see you next month. And because February is that kind of month, March will always be that kind of month. So it will also be March 26th at noon.
Easy to remember.
There you go. There you go. Make it easy on yourselves, folks. All right. So we'll see you guys then. Stay tuned.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.